And okay, I will try to get to the points, right? So I'm just a little bit think about my funding, and this is in the framework of the project, the place of equality in John Stuart Mill City, which is financed by the National Science Center in Poland, and I got also some funding from my university, so I'm really happy about having this. This is the opportunity to for me to be here. So I will try to get to the point, and the aim of the presentation is that the John Stuart Mill and Harriet Mill were both representatives of the student feminism and share the critical demands for women's equality, such as access to education, gainful employment, as well as in marriage and voting rights. The subjection of women is the text most often cited for the presentation of John Stuart Mill's arguments. However, both John Stuart and Harriet also authored other texts describing the role and place of women in society. Early essays on marriage and divorce, which were mutually exchanged by John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill, and the transshipment of women by Harriet Taylor Mill, they found the position of women of those days and reflect on what women could be if they were not be shackled by the bonds of subjection. I argue that John Stuart and Harriet Taylor derived different conclusions from the thesis of the artificial character of woman's nature present in their time about what the position of women in society should be. The aim of my presentation will be therefore to make a comparative analysis on the essays of John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor Mill, and to show how the former postulates evolved under the inspiration of the letters. I will outline the main differences and similarities between them on the issue of women's opportunities and their place and role in society, especially in the case of married women's financial independence, as well as their vocation to marriage and motherhood. I will also show that Mill's consideration for the determinants of the capitalist economy led him to see the role of women differently than Taylor Mill perceived it. Ultimately, I will argue that Harriet Taylor Mill's postulates were more radical than those proposed by John Stuart Mill. Okay, so just to start, about the role and place of women in society in early essays on marriage and divorce. I could say that Mill and Harriet Taylor met in 1830 at the dinner party hosted by Unitarian radical William Fox, and from then on their relationship began to develop. At the time of their first meeting, John Stuart was 24 years old, Harriet was a year younger, had remained married for over 4 years and had 2 sons, and her daughter Helen was born in 1831. It is impossible to tell the all-intricate story of their long-standing love relationship eventually culminated in marriage. Let us just to say that they were both exposed themselves to a great deal of unpleasantness because of the arrangement they found themselves in with her husband, John Taylor, until his death in 1849. Between 1831 and early 1832, John Stuart and Harriet Taylor wrote essays for each other on women and their situation in marriage. Written some 37 years before the publication of The Subjection of Women, these 2 essays are of particular importance. They highlight the problem of divorce and the issue of child custody in the light of Harriet's factual marriage. They were first published by Friedrich August von Hayek in 1951. So there are a couple of differences in the arguments developed by John Stuart and Harriet in the 2 essays. from which it appears that she has a more radical and assertive. She was more radical and assertive in her views, more impulsive and less intellectually arranged than Mill. She argues in a very emphatic way that the education of women reduces only to the one goal, to gain their living by marrying. To be married is the object of their existence, and the object being gained, they do really cease to exist up to anything worth calling life or any useful purpose. Marriage is therefore woman's most important point of reference of her life is to be centered around it as her ultimate vocation and the best determinant of her usefulness. As for the question of divorce, on the other hand, she claims that there should be no restriction on obtaining it. Divorce law itself should be called the proof of affection on the principle that one should not stay in the relationship with a person for whom one has no feeling and from whom one really would wish to go. Moreover, the woman should take responsibility for the care of the children, thus eliminating the problem in divorce proceedings. Since a woman should be responsible for the upkeep of her children, she should give a careful thought as to how many children she would like to have, instead of considering more children as formal guarantee for closer tie to the man who feeds her. So, on the other hand, Mill was more cautious in his argument. From the difference in characters, in his view, there are other implications for the question of being married. Mill divided human characters into those of more impassioned as well as of inferior nature. The former are nobler and more capable of experiencing more refined, higher forms of happiness. The only condition for the development of the noble characters should be not to harm other people. The latter group is more sparse, elitist, while most people are influenced by common morality and function at the level of experiencing lower forms of happiness. Ultimately, Mill is of the opinion that in practice, in a tolerably moral state of society, the first choice would almost always, especially where it had produced children, be adhered to. Exceptional would be that uncongeniality of disposition as rendered it positively uncomfortable to one or both of the parties to live together. Another exception would entail a strong passion conflict by one of them for a third party. So both of these exceptions would provide sufficient justification for seeking the solution of marriage. Furthermore, Mill called for changes in marriage law, insisting that since people usually marry at young age, this always involves the risk of an error in choice, which in turn is the reason to seek divorce. Wanting to avoid possible demoralization as a result of repeated mistakes, it would be better to wait until after marriage to conceive a child. During this time, the couple can check if they are a good match. Mill was writing at the time whenever control may boil down to abstinence and with terminal intercourse, much less contraception. He was therefore aware that many people, before forming a sufficiently stable marital relationship, were unable to avoid pregnancy. Keeping children in the event of divorce was therefore a problem. On this point, Mill refers to Owen's ideas about living in a community responsible for the care of children. The second difference between John Stuart and Harriet concerns the use women should make of their education in the future. Harriet is once again more radical. If women are not to treat themselves as debatable commodity for bread, they must not only be well educated, but also must have access to any profession they wish to pursue. Therefore, public offices being open to them, like all occupations, should be divided between the sexes in their natural arrangements. It's worth noting that this passage suggests the need for economic independence, which could be the basis of women's livelihood, even outside marriage. Although Harriet does not develop this thought further, such implications seem to emerge from her demands. Also, the aforementioned caution in the decision to have offspring could support the status of an unmarried woman without the need to provide for her children materially, which in her times is inextricably linked in remaining married. It's worth mentioning that John Stuart devotes an entire essay almost exclusively to married women, making little mention of single women. At the beginning of the essay, he mentioned the social perception of those unmarried. So there is a quote: a single woman therefore is felt both by herself and others as a kind of acceptance of the surface of society, having no use of or function or office there. She is not indeed precluded from useful and honorable exertion of various kinds. But the married woman is presumed to be a useful member of society unless there is evidence to the contrary. A single woman must establish that very few, either women or men, even ever do establish an individual claim. The philosopher that argues that a married woman as an independent person has no rising debt in the society. She must properly justify her position. In a world where a woman is expected to be married first and foremost, marriage is therefore an indicator of women's social position and should not indisputably determine it. This different approach could be initiated when the marriage law is changed to one that is easier to pronounce. Further nuancing Mill's position on economic independence, it is important to note that he remains ambiguous on this point. In his view, the first step towards women equality should be education to ensure economic independence from a father or husband, while remaining financially dependent reduces a woman to a toy or slave. He further argues that dependence on another person should be voluntary and based only on affection. A woman subjected to proper education would be the economic dependence, would see that economic dependence in marriage is degrading and comparable to prostitution. In other words, the act of delivering up her person for bread. However, Mill's firm stance is neutralized in the next paragraph to be more conservative and cautious view, in which he criticizes economic equality between men and women, but by claiming that this would sink the economy and consequently lower wages. In his view, the need to provide women with an adequate education need to follow from the fact that woman should actually support herself because she should be capable of doing so. In the natural course of events, she will not. It is not desirable to burden the labor market with double number of competitors. Moreover, he adopted a more cautious, to put it more emphatically, conservative position, according to which a woman's aim should be to be associated with the man she loves, while her occupation after marriage should be reduced to a beautiful life by sharing fully and with brilliance her husband's activities and interests. Just looking at the time, and probably I will a little bit make it shorter. So yeah, this is the quote here about this position of milk. And what I want to say that such union with the beloved man from the perspective of contemporary psychology would be a form of unhealthy arrangement and intellectual, emotional symbiosis in which reciprocity is apparent and absent. The woman is expected to conform to her husband's interests, not the other way around. I will refer here for the purposes of nuancing male's position to York Willie's concept of couples in collusion, which is a type of approach derived from a psychoanalytic tradition. According to the author of Zweyer Beziehung, collusion is undisclosed shared gains between two partners, hidden from each other, which is caused by the same unresolved conflict for all involved. It might be noted that Mill proposes that such an arrangement is revealed in narcissistic collusion. According to Willie, as a result of the unconscious play of two partners in narcissistic collusion, there is a merging of the two selves and the fusion into total unity, a complete fusion, a complete conformity. So while translating this into the arrangement proposed by me, married woman would be at risk in this type of relationship of losing not only her independence, but even her own identity, since she would have to devote herself and give herself fully to the occupation and interest of her beloved man. Mill goes on to note, however, that women's social position will not become adequate until they are given the opportunity to support themselves through parental financial support or an education that enables them to work for a living. However, if women from the privileged classes were to become housewives, then depriving them of the opportunity to work despite their education could be demoralizing and reduce their agency and self-government. Despite her radical views, Harriet concluded her impassioned plea for a great change in the position of women with the appeal of John Stuart to become the apostle of all the highest virtues and teach the world that this is the way to true equality should look like. We now have a better understanding that there can be disconnect between fear declarations and personal dependence on men, which allows Harriet's critical judgments to be tempered. Intellectual liberation is easier than emotional liberation, so referring to Virginia Woolf and her essay Professions for Women, the strength of intellect is not enough to kill the angel in the house. Emotional independence is needed. All the more noteworthy are not only Harriet's radicalism and courage, but also the hardships of her own predicament in marriage devoid of affection and with no chance of obtaining divorce. Okay, so I move here to the role and place of women in society, in the enfranchisement of women. And the authorship of this essay remained a contentious issue for some time, and in 1851, writing to the editor of Westminster Review, Mill credited himself with the right to the text. But actually, in February of 1849, in a letter to Harriet, he mentioned her pamphlet on the questions, on women's question, which he believes would contribute much to the subject and encourages her to complete her work. Based on the comparative analysis between previous essays and marriage, on marriage and divorce, the subjection of women, American feminist and sociologist Alice Rossi concluded that the authorship of the enfranchisement of women should be attributed to Harriet, and this position has also been confirmed by other researchers. So the main body of the analysis is virtually unconnected with the introduction and conclusion. They refer to convention in Worcester, Massachusetts, which took place in the spring of 1850. Rossi suggests that the beginning and the end were added to the main text, and that the reference to current events was intended to increase its appeal. In her view, the content of the arguments also shows a similarity with the position taken in Taylor Mill's early essay on marriage and divorce, and that there is no clear similarity between the arguments and Mill's early essay and subjection of women. A key observation evidencing the discrepancy is that in the both essays, Mill disagrees that the married woman should seek employment. In enfranchisement of women, Harriet rejects this position with hesitation. Even if every woman at mother's stand had a claim on some men's effort, how infinitely preferable is the part of the income should be of women's earning, even if the aggregate sum were but little increased by, rather than she should be compelled to stand aside in order that men that may be the sole earners and the sole dispensers of what's earned. A woman who contributes materially to the support of the family cannot be treated in the same continuously tyrannical manner as one who, however she might do a domestic drudge, is dependent on the man for subsistence. In the 1851 essay, Harriet firmly rejects the idea of training women to become men companions. In her view, modern forms of education for women do not provide them with a thorough education, but only a superficial idea of difficult subjects, and therefore high mental powers in women would be but an exceptional accident until every career is open to them, and until they, as well as men, are educated for themselves and for the world, not one sex or the other. Harriet also notes that in the line with the views on the ideal marriage, which would be the merging of characters into one, it must be acknowledged that such dependence on the part of the woman would be demoralizing for both of partners in the relationship. I will a little bit shorten this part and I will try to conclude that quote that one can therefore take these words as a position to misconception of what he called earlier using psychoanalytic terminology, couples inclusion, and Taylor's Mill does not endorse the symbiotic arrangement and seems to show that intuitions that would indicate that such a relationship would be demoralizing and psychologically unhealthy for both sides of the relationship. To reiterate, Harriet's views is that women like men, should not only be the subject of compulsory education, but should also seek to participate in the workforce. So she argues that there is no inherent reason or necessity that all women should voluntarily choose to devote their lives to one animal function and its consequence. Number of women are wives and mothers only because there is no other open career open to them, no other occupation for their feelings or their activities. Every improvement in their education, an enlargement of their faculties, everything which renders them more qualified for any other mode of life, increases the number of those to whom it is injury and oppression to be denied choice. To say that women must be excluded from active life because maternity disqualifies them for it, it is to say that every other career should be forbidden them in order to maternity may be the only resource. That if women were free to choose whether to use primarily their functions, which they share with non-human animals, or rather to devote themselves to exploring the world using their intellectual capacities, creating and engaging in political activism, few women would prefer to remain an angel in house, keeping the flame of the domestic hearth burning. So I would a little bit make it summarize that actually in some fragments enfranchisement of women, Harriet argued that the choice of work or home would be necessary. So why in others she think that work outside the home and acting as a mother of and wife is possible for women. But actually, she concluded that what is wanted for women is equal rights, equal admission to all social privileges, not a position of art, a sort of sentimental priesthood. And as I see it, those are the women, these are strong, blunt words from brilliant, strong-willed women, and it's far more radical position that those expressed in Mill's essays, whether 20 years earlier or 20 years later. So I would like to move here to the role and place of women in society in the subjection of women. And I would like to focus on the fourth chapter of the subjection of women, where Mill presents a vision of ideal marriage relationship based on friendship. And so for him, it's a remedy to the relationship based on the dialectic of master and slave that was present in his time. This idea would consist in union of thoughts and inclination that would form the basis for lasting friendship between spouses. Mill praises marital friendship and in an example way, pointing to the moral richness of this form of human intimate bond. So there is a quote, when each of the persons, instead of being nothing, is something, when they are attached to one another, and they are not too much unlike to being with. The constant partaking in the same things affected by their sympathy draws out the latent capacities for each being interested in the things which were at least at first interesting only to the other. And works a gradual assimilation of the modification of the taste and characters to one another, partly by the insensible modification of each, but more by rich enriching of the two natures, each acquiring the taste and the capacities of the other in addition to its own. So when I was studying this quote again, because I was doing this a lot of time. When I was doing this for the preparation for this presentation, I was struck by the change in the depiction of the woman's role in marriage compared to males' early essays. Apparent here is not only the unification, but also the principle of complementarity between the two partners. It is no longer a concept that resembles symbiotic absorption. So in this ideal, it becomes important for these spouses to empathize with each other, to awaken them different capacities, which allows them to inspire each other to improve and strengthen the noble qualities of their character. So a perfectionist theme is thus evident here. Both partners in the relationship are characterized by their ability to improve themselves. So also, when we compare the essay from the 1830, it's a mistake. Male stands for more moderate position of more space for independence and autonomy. This position is closer to what is nowadays referred in psychology and interdependence, and characterized healthy partnership relation. So, according to Uehiro's concept, here we can speak of the greater maturity in the relationship, which is determined, among other things, by the equal status of the spouses. So this marriage would be one that functions well and is not exposed to the problem of entanglement in the collusion. And characteristics of such a relationship are the proper separation of the couple from other people and the establishment of the healthy boundaries between the partners. And the second important principle is that the partners in the relationship are of equal worth. In other words, equal in value. It is not vertical arrangement, but it's horizontal arrangement. And such relationship is therefore also the expression of the desire to realize the principle of justice. I would like to, okay, I have a little bit more time. Put here the emphasis that Nicholas Capaldi points out that the philosopher was inspired by the concept of autonomy thanks to Harriet, to whom this issue was close. So therefore, it can be summarized that in introducing such terms in subjection of woman, he does so in order to commemorate her heritage. It's also worth noting that the implications of the research on the stereometric analysis of the essay on liberty, according to which Harriet made a substantive contribution to the essay, including significant part of the chapter 3. Okay, so if we could attribute the authorship of this passage to Harriet, it would allow us to better understand why the perfectionist term in the marital relationship might be relevant not only to me, but also to his beloved. And my impression, however, is that the difference between them is that Harriet's normative conception is that woman should perfect herself for her own sake, not for the sake of men, and their perfectionism would be mutually exclusive with a woman's intellectual and emotional independence. Mir, on the other hand, seems to take more conservative position that marriage would be a friendship of a similar, and there is a risk of inherent in such relationship that, according to the principle of similarity, it is the woman who should conform to the man, not the other way around. So what I want to say also that the perfectionism, seen from the perspective on perceiving woman's place in marriage, would have a different axiological dimension for both of them. In Harriet's case, it would be consistent with values such individualism and independence for the woman, and only later in the interdependence in the relationship. Whereas in John Stuart's case, friendship and bonding between both partners would be more important. There is another, and for me, very important implication, a very radical implication of perfectionism and individualism in Harriet's conception, that the option becomes possible for women to remain single, and the marriage would not be the single most desirable stage for a woman. Okay, I will try to just move forward because just a little bit more nuanced the situation of what Mia would say about the role of women at the labor market, but I will omit that. So I would like to say in summary that the normative conception of marriage in the subjection of woman is more moderate in that his earlier position. In imagining the relationship between spouses, Mill adopts an approach that promotes equality of both partners, which is psychologically healthier than the position he proposed in his early essay. Furthermore, he notes that the need to educate women's abilities so that they can compete with men as equals, in which case that the success of the competition would be determined by merit and not by being born as a man, which until now has been the only rightful claim to power and authority. However, there is still an aporia between the cries for women's independence and her vocation to family life, and consequently her resignation from working life. Certainly, it is possible for women who does not contribute to the family budget to be in healthy relationship in which economic issues do not limit her independence. Such one may assume was the idea of the spousal relationship according to me. However, let us be realistic from the contemporary perspective in which the capitalist system is dominant. We understand perspective well that the situation of completely asymmetrical contribution to family finances can create a fertile ground for dependency, manipulation, abuse, all forms of violence, including economic violence. And what I like to say for the end, that I know from my own experience how difficult it is to stand by your own feminist when you're economically dependent on a man with the conservative, deeply patriarchal views. So therefore, I understand the momentousness of Harriet's position and that of many other women who have been and are in the similar position of her, since I know how difficult it is to extricate oneself from the economic and psychological dependence and to finally walk away from a man from whom I would really wish to go. But well, I'm a feminist. Okay, so thank you for this.
Thank you so much. And thanks very much for your very interesting paper, Sveta. I really enjoyed it. And I think your overall project in this paper to compare the views of Harriet Taylor Mill and John Stuart Mill, who are two very important figures in the history of feminism, is very worthwhile and used a lot of important insights. So the main point of my comments is just going to be to ask for clarification on a few things and invite you to expand on some of the main themes of your paper. So I think one of the most interesting claims in your paper is that Harriet, I'm just going to call both of them by their first names, is more radical with respect to women's equality than is John Stuart, JS. So I wanted to ask a few things on that kind of general theme. So first, I wanted to ask for some clarification on the claims you make about the structure of the arguments. So you say that Harriet and JS's different positions on the place of women in society are arrived at on the basis of what appears to be like a shared view of the artificial character of women's nature. So I wasn't entirely clear how the move was made from this kind of shared premise to the different conclusions. So perhaps it might be worth spelling out a bit more where exactly the claim about artificiality fits into the argument, because on the face of it, it seems like they may just have different normative views, and that this might be the basis of the differences between them. Second, a few points on marriage and divorce, which is very interesting, I thought. So you say that Harriet and JS differ on the issue of the conditions on which divorce is permissible, with the former being more radical than the latter. So Harriet says that a lack of affection for one's spouse is sufficient to permit divorce, whereas JS seems to resist this and opt for like a less liberal view. Harriet's view, as you describe it, rests on the principle that one should not stay in a relationship with a person for whom one has no feelings and from whom one really would wish to go. JS says that divorce is permissible only when uncongeniality of disposition has made it positively uncomfortable to one or both of the parties to live together, or when one party to the marriage has strong feelings for a third party. So one thing is that you say that Harriet thinks that one should leave the marriage when one lacks affection for one's spouse and wishes not to be with them. So this seems too strong. One might agree that it would be permissible to end a marriage for this reason, but disagree that one should, all things considered, end the marriage for this reason. So the should claim makes Harriet's view more radical, but also less plausible. And I think here it might also be worth specifying whether the should in this case is a moral or prudential one. I was also wondering whether Harriet and JS may be closer in their views on divorce than you allow. So one might argue that a case in which one has no affection for one's spouse and wishes to leave them will also be a case in which the uncongeniality of one's disposition has made it uncomfortable for the person without affect to live with the spouse they lack affection for, maybe vice versa. But if this is the case, then it seems that JS might hold that divorce is permissible in many of the cases in which Harriet would, so their positions might be closer than you've suggested on this. And then a final point on marriage and divorce. So I wasn't completely convinced that Harriet is on balance more radical than JS on divorce. So Harriet seems to suppose on your account that women should be responsible for any children after divorce. This again seems too strong, and this assumption seems to make her view potentially less radical than JS's, since he seems to not to presuppose that women should be responsible for childcare, given his discussion of Owen's ideas about living in a community responsible for children and childcare. So Harriet's views on childcare, at least, don't seem very radical to me. And I was wondering what you thought about that. And then a third point on employment. So you said that what Harriet says about women's employment is a far more radical position than those expressed in JS's essays, whether 20 years earlier or 20 years later. So this seems to require some further explanation, maybe. So JS seems, at least in some places, in subjection to agree that position of employment ought to be open to women and men equally. So it may be true that JS changed his mind on this issue, and that this was because of Harriet. That seems plausible, but it's less clear that he's less radical in the end than Harriet. So I was wondering whether you could say something more about those things. I also have some other questions, but maybe other people would like to ask some questions too. So thanks very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I realize, there's a lot you could answer to there. Maybe if you could pick a couple of the most salient points, so we can have a bit more time for discussion as well, and then perhaps you can also discuss this later in more detail.
Should I respond first?
Yeah, if you'd like to the main.
Okay, so this is a lot of content here, so I'm not sure if I really understand everything what you mentioned, and I will try to be more specific as I can. But okay, so first thing that you mentioned about the woman's nature, that the actually, at the beginning, I just was mentioning the test that the artificiality of human nature derives the different conclusion from the woman position in a society. So, well, I just what I wanted to said here, but it was not really elaborated, just more clearly there. That I think that women's how John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor thought about women's nature, that how we see right now the nature of women, in the Victorian era, it was not really what women are, but this is the some kind of social construct based on tradition, on the common, and that's why it's artificial. So I think that they were in similar position to thinking about that they don't see the real nature of the real how women are really whom they could be if they had their opportunity to just be. They to have their rights, right? So actually, it's something that we don't know from Mill's position, and actually, I think Harriet was in similar position to Mill. I'm not sure if I understanding clearly what you were mentioning, but if you want to just say something about this, just.
No, that's great. Thanks very much.
Okay, because yes, I know that as well. I was just mentioning this part, and I was not really elaborating this more, closer. But I think that some point that I could just explain more clearly in my paper. And okay, so when you just move the second remark that about the permissibility of divorce and well, I was probably not really clear about Mill's position because I think that his point of view on divorce is also that about the permissibility, and that well, actually, when people are not feeling that they want to be together, they just should be they should just divorce, right? So I'm not. I'm probably in this point. Well, actually, I see right now what you were mentioning, that I made it that Harriet was more radical, and actually I think that, yeah, John Stuart Mill had some points, different points, but actually his point of view in this early essay is not really like, not really moderate, right? So, yeah, what can I say also about the problem of divorce, that actually that's not, it's not mentioned here, but this problem was also more I think moderate in the later works. Well, for example, on liberty, where John Stuart and Harriet Taylor, because I would say that they were both the authors on the essay, they were more like, where actually they were taking into consideration more the goodness of the third party and the children. So actually they a little bit more like here at the beginning are more radical, and after that they started to a little bit be like not really radical that they were at the beginning, right? So this is what I can say about this.
Yeah, so I noticed that when you talk about like those relationship models being healthy or not, you reference like only one source, you reference, I think it's Willie 2014 work.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering, like, I don't know, for example, regarding, John Stuart Mill's, views on marriage, really similar to the contemporary psychological independence theory. So are there any, like you said, that was like healthy according to Willie, but are there any other contemporary psychologists who are more critical of this psychological interdependence theory?
Okay, so I'm not sure if you're asking me about do other psychologists are also discussing the theory of, yeah, it's okay. So actually, what I was trying to explain that Willie actually is not mentioning a Mill, but in particular in his explanations about this theory of couples collusion. He wrote his works in 70s, in 1970s. So actually, afterwards, and it's a long tradition of psychoanalytic. I mean, Will is a part of the tradition, but he's working on the couples. So basically, the psychoanalytic tradition is more like between the therapeutic and the psychoanalytic adaptation. And here we can have some kind of dynamic between the couple, right? So this is a part of tradition, and well, we can just interpret it in this part, but it's, I know it's some kind of a historicism, so I understand whether that this is a kind of my point of view, that it's a little bit biased by yes, like homiletic tradition, but still I think that it might be in somehow helpful to understand how actually wanted to well present how they what are the implications of their point of view, the Harriet's position on marriage and the Mill's position, yeah, the John Stuart Mill position. Okay, so what I want to say.
Thank you very much.